Blitzkrieg and meth. It was the Germans' tactical brainchild during World War II. It was a mechanized nightmare for their enemies. It combined tanks, infantry, and air support in a synchronized assault. It was designed to overwhelm defenses before anyone could react. Developed by military strategists like Heinz Guderian, the idea was to skip the trench warfare nonsense of World War I and replace it with attacks that just go boom, boom, boom in speed. Tanks like the Panzer III led the charge, while Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, making sure everyone on the ground was thoroughly miserable. Infantry wasn't far behind, cleaning up whatever scraps of resistance were left. Speedrunning was quite literal in this sense because of Pervitin, a type of meth handed out like candy to soldiers to keep them awake, alert, and too jittery to care about little things. Wehrmacht soldiers popped these pills to keep marching for days without rest, making them the closest thing to zombies you'd see outside a George Romero movie. The drug's effects might have included continuous physical all-nighters, but at the cost of hallucinations, aggression, and heart failure. Basically everything you'd want in a soldier who's already driving a tank through your living room. The effectiveness of Blitzkrieg was undeniable, at least early on. Poland in 1939 was wiped in weeks. Same goes with France. The tactic relied on exploiting weak points in enemy defenses and then diving through those gaps like a wrecking ball at a demolition derby. Communication between units was key, with radios installed in every tank to ensure they could coordinate movements on the fly. This was cutting-edge stuff for the time, and it's what allowed German forces to cover ground faster than anyone thought possible. The sheer speed and brutality of the attacks left defenders paralyzed. Their command structures shattered before they could even figure out which way was up. Of course, no tactic is invincible. For starters, it required resources: fuel, ammo, meth, some more meth, and spare parts. It's because these were consumed at an alarming rate, and when supply lines couldn't keep up, the whole operation just stops. This became painfully obvious during the invasion of the Soviet Union, where the Germans bit off more than even their meth-fueled soldiers could chew. The vast distances, brutal winters, and stiff Soviet resistance made Blitzkrieg vulnerable. Additionally, once the Allies caught on to the tactic, they adapted. Depth in defenses, stronger fortifications, and counterattacks exploited the weaknesses of Blitzkrieg. Scorched earth policy. Russia's way of saying, if we can't have it, no one can. It happened when Napoleon was invading them in 1812. The Russians, under Tsar Alexander I and military leaders like General Mikhail Kutuzov, saw Napoleon's grand army coming and decided to make the French regret ever stepping foot in their territory. Instead of meeting Napoleon head-on in pitched battles that could result in devastating losses, they started torching their own villages, destroying food supplies, and even sabotaging wells and rivers, just to make sure the advancing French army had absolutely nothing to live off. It was the ultimate burn the bridge behind you strategy. Except this time, the bridges were entire towns and fields of crops. To put it lightly, Napoleon's soldiers were not thrilled about this arrangement, which quickly turned their military campaign into a survival show. The Russians had a solid plan, and that plan involved making sure Napoleon's troops starved and froze to death before they could do any real damage. They evacuated entire villages ahead of the French advance, relocating people and livestock while setting everything else on fire. Food stocks were systematically destroyed, and there's even evidence of soldiers salting fields to ruin future harvests. They were basically saying, if we're going down, we're taking your lunch with us. This wasn't a new thing though. Scorched earth policies had been used in ancient wars. It's just that the Russians beautifully polluted the earth for territories better than everyone else. And while Napoleon's army was full of professional soldiers, they weren't prepared to eat charred dirt and melted snow for months on end. By the time Napoleon's grand army made it to Moscow in September 1812, they were in bad shape. Thousands of men had already died from starvation and disease. Morale was lower than Napoleon's hopes of a quick victory. Moscow itself was abandoned by the Russians and, surprise, also on fire. With no supplies left to plunder and winter closing in, Napoleon realized he couldn't keep his troops in Russia any longer. The retreat began in October, and it was an absolute disaster. The scorched earth policy left them with no shelter, no food, and no chance of survival in the brutal Russian winter. Of the 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, only about 100,000 made it out alive. The rest died from hunger, extreme cold, sickness, or random Russians popping out of nowhere. Even while most of them were dying, General Kutuzov's army kept chasing them. Kamikaze. The idea of kamikaze tactics in World War II was born out of desperation and an alarming level of commitment. In late 1944, as the Allied forces closed in on Japan, the country was running out of experienced pilots, aircraft, and basically every resource except for unyielding nationalism. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, clearly the guy who didn't understand the word no, proposed the plan to use pilots to crash planes loaded with explosives into enemy ships. They called it Kamikaze, or Divine Wind, a name so pretentious it almost made made sense they were about to do something this insane. The pilots, many barely out of their teens, were convinced or guilt-tripped into thinking this was the ultimate act of honor. Kinda like seppuku, but with planes. What they were really doing was weaponizing their own deaths. The kamikaze attacks themselves were straightforward. A pilot would take off in a plane loaded with bombs, aiming to smash into an allied ship with maximum destruction. And those planes were often stripped down to bare essentials, because who needs landing gear when you're not coming back? Training was laughably minimal, more of a fly-straight, hit-hard vibe than an actual crash course. The targets were usually allied aircraft carriers, destroyers, and transport ships, with the intent to cripple naval operations. And these attacks were terrifyingly effective. Even with allied ships being outfitted with more anti-aircraft defenses, hundreds of ships were damaged, and several were sunk outright. Corpses. The 1346 Siege of Kaffa is where things got medieval, literally. The Mongols, led by Johnny Beg, were laying siege to this Genoese-controlled trade hub on the Crimean Peninsula. But then, their camp got hit by the Black Death. Now, instead of cutting their losses like sane people, they cooked up one of history's most chaotic ideas. The Mongols hauled plague-infected corpses to their trebuchets and chucked them over the city walls. Yeah, they weaponized rotting human bodies. The stench alone must have been nightmare fuel, but the bacteria-laden bodies were the real problem. This was Yersinia pestis in action. The Mongols turned disease into a projectile, and Kaffa got a first-hand demonstration of early biological warfare. No hazmat suits required. Inside Kaffa, the Genoese defenders were battling a literal disease. People started dropping like flies, and it wasn't from sword fights. The infected corpses delivered by Mongol airmail spread the plague faster than gossip in a small town. This created a chain reaction of panic. As the bodies piled up, the disease ran wild, and with nowhere to run, the city crumbled. It's not like anyone back then had a solid grasp of germ theory, so their best strategy was, well, to die a little slower than their neighbors. The Genoese survivors eventually fled the city, unknowingly taking the plague with them. If you ever wondered how the Black Death spread across Europe, thank these merchants for the free shipping. But come to think of it, this wouldn't happen had the Mongols were not infected with it themselves. They were the original patient zeros in this disaster. Plague had already ravaged their ranks, thinning out their army before they even thought of weaponizing it, and even when they did, they still didn't capture Kaffa. The city held out long enough for the Genoese to escape, taking their plague souvenirs with them. So, everyone lost. The Mongols didn't get the city, the Genoese got a plague outbreak, and Europe got its most catastrophic pandemic ever. Countermeasures weren't a thing. What were they going to do? Catapult their own corpses back? People didn't even know what caused the plague, let alone how to stop it. The idea of quarantines and public health wouldn't emerge until much later. For now, they were just winging it. Napalm. Napalm came into the Vietnam War like a middle finger dipped in fire, developed during World War II and perfected by Harvard scientists. Yeah, book smarts really went far here. It became one of the most infamous weapons in modern warfare. Napalm was essentially jellied gasoline, designed to stick to whatever it touched and burn at ridiculously high temperatures. The US military figured this would be a brilliant way to torch Vietnam's dense forests, flush out Viet Cong hideouts, and make guerrilla tactics harder to pull off. Dropped from planes, it would spread over a wide area, incinerating trees, enemy positions, and anything else unlucky enough to be in the way. The execution was as straightforward as it was devastating. Fighter jets, particularly the F-4 Phantoms, carried napalm bombs and unleashed them on targets below. These bombs burst on impact, creating massive fireballs that consumed everything in their path. Villages, crops, and civilians often found themselves on the wrong end of this strategy. Soldiers on the ground used portable flamethrowers loaded with napalm for smaller-scale attacks, mostly when they suspected enemies were hiding in tunnels or bunkers. It was essentially a weaponized version of "get the hell out" and came with no pause button. Napalm burns at around 1500 to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning it erased people. Civilians caught in napalm strikes often suffered severe burns, with many dying outright or later from their injuries. Survivors were disfigured, if not completely traumatized. Entire villages went up in flames, taking homes, livelihoods, and lives with them. Environmentally, it turned swathes of Vietnam into scorched wastelands. The forests, which once provided cover for the Viet Cong, were reduced to ashes. Crops burned too, which led to food shortages. Countering napalm wasn't easy, mostly because there wasn't much you could do against a weapon designed to stick to you and keep burning. Viet Cong fighters tried digging deeper tunnels and fortifying their bunkers, but napalm's widespread destruction made these measures feel like patching a sinking ship with duct tape. Civilians had little recourse, often left to run, hide, or hope they weren't in the strike zone. On the flip side, the controversy surrounding napalm fueled anti-war sentiment globally, putting pressure on the US to curb its use. A horse? for a gift. When the Greeks, stuck outside the walls of Troy for 10 years, finally got tired of playing campfire games, they made up this plan. It was allegedly cooked up by Odysseus, who clearly had watched one too many heist dramas in his head. The idea? Build a giant wooden horse, hide a bunch of soldiers inside it, and convince the Trojans it was a gift. And because ancient propaganda was basically a bunch of guys yelling stuff, they spread the word that it was an offering to Athena. The Trojans, thinking they'd won, and the Greeks were just really bad losers, brought the horse inside their walls. The Greeks had to make the horse believable, though. They left a guy named Sinon behind to sell the story. His job was to act like he had beef with the Greeks, claim the horse was some divine peace token, and basically gaslight the Trojans into thinking this was their lucky day. Now you'd think someone might have said, hey, maybe we should check if this hollow horse is stuffed with bad ideas. But nope, the Trojans had one job, and that is to be skeptical. They blew it. Even Cassandra, who had the annoying gift of always being right but never believed, tried to warn them. Also Laocoon, the priest who famously shouted something about Greeks bearing gifts before he and his sons were eaten by sea serpents. If that didn't scream bad vibes, nothing would. Once the horse was inside the city and everyone was busy throwing a "we survived a decade-long siege" party, the Greeks made their move. The soldiers crawled out of the horse like the most aggressive piñata ever. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet that had pretended to sail away just circled back because, obviously, they weren't giving up that easily. The soldiers inside the city opened the gates for the rest of the army, and what followed was less a battle and more a one-sided slaughter. Troy, a city that had managed to withstand a decade of siege warfare, was razed in a single night, all because they fell for a free horse. Troy got looted, burned, and reduced to rubble, while its people were either killed or enslaved. Meanwhile, the Greeks returned home with plenty of loot and new stories to traumatize their kids with. Not everyone had a happy ending, though. Odysseus, the mastermind of this little scheme, spent another 10 years lost at sea because the gods don't take bribes, and Aeneas, one of the few Trojan survivors, supposedly fled to have his descendants found Rome. Operation Overlord. The massive Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France in June 1944 was a logistical and tactical beast that kicked off with an amphibious assault on Normandy's beaches. The guy behind the curtain was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who probably didn't sleep a wink planning this thing. The Allies spent months fooling the Germans into thinking they'd attack Calais instead, throwing in fake radio messages, inflatable tanks, and more decoys than ever. The actual operation involved over 156,000 troops, thousands of ships, and a ridiculous amount of equipment. Early morning on June 6th, airborne divisions parachuted in to seize key roads and bridges. You'd think jumping out of planes in the dark would be bad enough. But nope, many got scattered, missed their targets, or landed in fields full of Nazis. That start was their first welcome to Normandy moment. The main event was the amphibious landings on 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah went relatively smoothly, thanks to good planning and lighter German resistance. Meanwhile, Omaha turned into a bloodbath because someone thought storming a beach covered by cliffs and heavy machine guns was a solid idea. Troops waded through water, dodging bullets, mines, and underwater obstacles. Engineers had to clear paths through the defenses while under fire. Medics worked overtime trying to patch up the unlucky ones who didn't duck fast enough. By the end of the day, Omaha was taken, but at the cost of thousands of lives. If you ever want to see what determination, and a lack of other options, looks like, this was it. Once the beaches were secure, the Allies started unloading everything. Tanks, artillery, jeeps, and enough rations to feed an army. The logistics here were insane, involving portable harbors called mulberry harbors and fuel pipelines stretched across the English Channel. The Germans, meanwhile, were scrambling. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the guy in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall, wasn't even in Normandy when the invasion started. He was celebrating his wife's birthday. His absence didn't help, but honestly, the Germans were already spread too thin to mount a proper defense. Their response was slow, partly because of Hitler's micromanagement. He refused to release reserve units until it was too late. That's what happens when you let a wannabe artist run military operations. After taking the beaches, the Allies moved inland, but no victory yet. They faced tough resistance in the hedgerows, those thick, bushy barriers that made every field a death trap. German troops, tanks, and snipers made sure the Allies had to fight for every inch. The Battle of Caen, for example, dragged on for weeks, with the British and Canadians slugging it out against well-entrenched German forces. Casualties piled up on both sides, and the destruction was so bad that Caen looked like someone had run it through a meat grinder. Meanwhile, American forces were pushing westward toward Cherbourg to secure a port, which they eventually did after more fighting. The Allies suffered over 10,000 casualties on D-Day alone, but at least they now have a ground in Europe. Machetes. The Rwandan Genocide started with the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana. His plane got blown out of the sky on April 6th, and things went from bad to apocalyptic overnight. Hutu extremists wasted no time blaming the Tutsi minority and started executing a plan that they'd been fine-tuning for months. By fine-tuning, I mean stashing machetes like they were party supplies. These machetes were just regular farm tools turned into weapons of mass murder. That's how 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were hacked to death in a mere 100 days. For context, that's about 8,000 people per day, every day, for over 3 months. The militias leading this were called Interahamwe, which means those who work together, although those who murder together would have been more accurate. These guys had training, coordination, and a lot of radio broadcasts telling them to kill Tutsi neighbors. If you didn't have an ID card proving you were Hutu, well, congrats, you were on the chopping block. And since these militias weren't exactly brain surgeons, they used crude propaganda to fuel the violence, labeling Tutsi people as cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. They relied on machetes, clubs, and when they were feeling fancy, grenades or guns. What made it worse was how personal it all was. People weren't shot from a distance. They were hunted down in their homes, schools, and churches, often by neighbors and acquaintances. If you ever thought your HOA meetings were tense, imagine them turning into death squads. The worst part? Some priests and nuns even handed over Tutsi refugees hiding in churches. The very places meant to be sanctuaries became slaughterhouses. It was the kind of betrayal that would make Judas look like a saint. The United Nations had peacekeepers in Rwanda, but didn't give them permission to actually, keep the peace. Western countries mostly ignored it, because who needs to care about an African genocide when there's bureaucracy to deal with? Meanwhile, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Paul Kagame, was fighting back. These were Tutsi rebels who eventually overthrew the Hutu government and stopped the genocide. Volley fire, as the 17th century musketeers developed it, was an organized killing machine. The whole thing worked because early muskets were about as accurate as throwing a rock with your eyes closed, and reloading them took forever. Some genius, likely Dutch or Swedish military commanders like Maurice of Nassau, thought, why not turn this mess into a group project? They lined up musketeers in rows. The front line fired, then stepped back to reload, while the next line took over. Repeat until the other guys were more holes than soldiers. Performing this tactic was an exercise in discipline because, shocker, standing still while people shot at you wasn't super popular. The soldiers trained to keep their cool and follow commands. It goes like this. You're in the first line, you fire, then shuffle back while trying not to trip over your buddy or drop your musket. Reloading was no joke either. It involved pouring powder, ramming a ball, and priming the pan, all while pretending the enemy's bullets weren't whizzing past your head, and the officers were the sadistic coaches yelling, "Faster!" while hoping you didn't just run off screaming. Somehow it worked, and armies got a hell of a lot deadlier. The effects of volley fire were not unnoticed, especially in large-scale battles. When an entire block of musketeers fired simultaneously, it was less a line of soldiers and more a wall of lead. Enemies caught in the barrage didn't have time to reflect on their life choices. They were too busy falling over dead. This was particularly effective against cavalry. Horses are smart enough to avoid running straight into bullets, no matter how fancy their riders' hats were. Infantry caught in the open got it even worse. Countering volley fire was tricky, but it wasn't impossible. Armies started using terrain and cover more strategically, like hiding behind hills or in forests where musketeers couldn't get a clean shot. Cavalry learned to flank these slow-moving blocks, exploiting gaps in coordination. And when artillery became more mobile, the tables turned quickly. A well-placed cannonball didn't care how disciplined your rows were. If you were hit, you're gonna die with that big ball hitting you in your face. Corpses. Part 2. During World War II, some genius with a taste for sadistic creativity thought, what if we rigged corpses to explode? And thus, booby-trapped corpses became a thing. This tactic involved stuffing dead bodies with explosives and leaving them in strategic locations where enemy forces would stumble upon them. It goes something like a soldier finds what looks like a fallen comrade, bends down to inspect it, and boom. The Germans, ever the engineers of destruction, were infamous for this during the war, though the Allies reportedly pulled a few stunts of their own. The goal was to weaponize the natural human instinct to recover bodies or show respect for the dead. The body, often already decomposing because, war, was hollowed out and packed with explosives like TNT or grenades. Triggers were cleverly hidden, often linked to the movement of the body itself. Sometimes they'd rig it so that the explosives detonated when the corpse was lifted. A particularly nasty surprise for any poor soul trying to clear the battlefield. Other times, these booby traps were connected to objects near the body, like weapons, personal belongings, or even the ground beneath it. This made the setup even deadlier since there was no obvious pattern. Aside from the obvious carnage caused by the explosions, they created widespread paranoia among soldiers. Imagine being scared to touch anything, even a fellow soldier's remains. Troops became jumpy and suspicious, which was exactly the point. The tactic wasn't limited to corpses either. Abandoned equipment, seemingly safe buildings, or even everyday objects were rigged to explode. But a dead person about to die again via bombs had a special kind of horrifying flair. Countermeasures eventually developed, though it's not like there was a foolproof way to deal with a dead body that might blow up in your face. Sappers, soldiers trained in bomb disposal, were often tasked with clearing these traps. Their job was to inspect suspicious bodies or objects for explosive devices, a task that needed nerves of steel and an insurance policy that covers explosions. Protocols included probing bodies with long sticks, using detection equipment, or, in some cases, just blowing them up from a safe distance. But even with precautions, mistakes happened, and the trap still worked. While the attacks managed to sink about 50 Allied ships and damage hundreds more, the cost was astronomical in terms of human lives. Thousands of pilots, most of whom were young, inexperienced, and manipulated into believing this was the pinnacle of patriotic duty. The Allies, meanwhile, adapted quickly, beefing up ship defenses and implementing strategies like picket destroyers to intercept kamikaze planes before they could reach the main fleet. Radar systems were also improved to detect incoming planes earlier, making it increasingly difficult for these missions to achieve their goals. It's almost like Japan was throwing its last chips on the table while the dealer just walked away with the pot. In the end, kamikaze tactics didn't stop the inevitable defeat of Japan, mainly because they got nuked twice in 2 days. Wars were metaphorically a game of chess, then and now. Whoever has the better tactic, whoever has the better adjustments, and whoever has the more devastating weapons win. I mean, if you want to win a war as fast as lightning, you can do it by not starting a war at all, or an asteroid. See y'all.